Shaquille O'Neal intervenes when a rude customer attacks an employee with Down syndrome. Heart pounding against her ribs, Eleanor gripped the weathered box in her trembling hands. The attic air hung thick with dust and memories as afternoon light sliced through the single window, illuminating the faded label. David's things do not open. 23 years of silence compressed into cardboard walls. Around her, relatives bustled through the old house, their voices muffled beneath the roar in her ears. The funeral reception continued downstairs, cucumber sandwiches, sympathetic, murmurs and hollow platitudes about her father's peaceful passing. Eleanor traced the box's edge, remembering the night she'd sealed it, 16 years old, rage burning through her tears as she shoved away every remnant of the man who'd walked out. Now, at 39, that same man lay in fresh earth across town, a stranger she'd refused to see even as cancer claimed him. She'd come only to sell the house, not to forgive. Her fingers found the tape sealing the box. One quick movement, and she could walk away, leave the past buried. But something, curiosity, grief, or perhaps the weight of unfinished business, made her hesitate. "You don't have to do this," came a voice from the attic stairs. Shaquille, her younger brother, stood watching her with eyes that mirrored their father's, perceptive, kind, infuriatingly understanding. Unlike Eleanor, he'd maintained contact with their father after the divorce, had even moved back to care for him in those final months. 23 years, Shaquille. 23 years he had to explain, to apologize, and nothing. She turned, the box in her hands. "I don't owe him this. Maybe you owe it to yourself." Shaquille crossed the attic, dust swirling in his wake. "He left something specifically for you. Asked me to make sure you got it." Eleanor's jaw tightened. "More excuses?" "I don't know, he just said you'd understand once you saw it." The box suddenly felt heavier. In the silence between heartbeats, Eleanor made her decision. She ripped off the tape in one violent motion, yanked open the lid, and found herself staring at a stack of envelopes, each marked with a date and her name. Hundreds of them, spanning decades. The first envelope, yellowed with age, bore her 16th birthday. With unsteady fingers, she tore it open and unfolded a letter in her father's distinctive handwriting. "Eleanor, my brightest star. You won't read this today. Maybe not for years, but I'm writing anyway, hoping someday you'll understand why. I left, not because I didn't love you enough to stay, but because I loved you too much to let you watch me destroy myself." The letter blurred as tears filled Eleanor's eyes. Beneath it lay another and another. Birthdays, Christmases, graduations, every milestone he'd missed marked with words she'd refused to hear. In her hands, she held the weight of echoes, voices silenced too long, truths buried beneath decades of carefully cultivated anger. And as family murmured downstairs, Eleanor began to read the story she'd never allowed herself to know. David Chen had always measured his life in certainties. His corner office at Westridge Financial, the premium scotch he drank exactly, so twice weekly. The absolute trust in his wife Maya's devotion after 17 years of marriage. The unconditional love of his children, 16-year-old Eleanor, whose fierce intelligence mirrored his own, and 12-year-old Shaquille, whose gentle nature balanced them both. Then came the merger announcement. Westridge Financial absorbed by a larger firm. David's position restructured after nearly 2 decades of loyal service. His credentials, suddenly insufficient without the MBA, he'd forgone to support his young family. His future uncertain. That night, David had poured 3 fingers of scotch instead of his customary 2. The next night, 4. Within weeks, he'd abandoned counting altogether, finding solace in the amber liquid that dulled the edges of his mounting anxiety. Each morning, he pretended to leave for phantom job interviews while actually sitting in coffee shops, drinking away the hours and his family's savings. Maya noticed first the slurred words at dinner, the increasing irritability, the dwindling bank balance. The arguments began as whispers after the children went to bed, then escalated to midnight shouting matches that Eleanor and Shaquille pretended not to hear through their bedroom walls. They can't see you like this, Maya had finally whispered one night after David knocked over a lamp during a particularly vicious fight. I can't let them see their father this way. It was Eleanor who discovered the truth. Ever perceptive, she'd grown suspicious of her father's vague answers about potential jobs. One afternoon, instead of going to debate practice, she'd followed him, watching from across the street as he spent hours in a bar rather than the interview he'd claimed to have. She'd confronted him that night, her young face twisted with disappointment that cut deeper than any of Maya's accusations. "You lied," she'd said simply, "to all of us." Something broke in David that night, the last remnant of the man he'd thought himself to be. The next morning, he'd packed a single suitcase while his family slept. He left a note promising child support, which he faithfully sent, working whatever jobs he could find, but offering no real explanation. He couldn't bear to see their faces as they watched him crumble. The divorce papers arrived 3 months later. Maya moved the children to her sister's home in another state. David rented a small apartment near his childhood neighborhood and began the slow, painful process of rebuilding himself. Alcoholics, anonymous meetings, community college courses, therapy sessions, where he confronted the pride that had prevented him from admitting his struggles to those he loved most. 6 months after leaving, David wrote his first letter to Eleanor, an explanation, an apology. He sealed it in an envelope, addressed it, but never found the courage to send it. Instead, he wrote another the next month and the next, creating a paper trail of remorse and recovery that no one would read. When Shaquille turned 18, he reached out to David, cautious, at first then with growing frequency, but Eleanor refused all contact. Her graduation announcements were returned unopened, wedding invitations met with silence, the birth of her son unacknowledged. David kept writing, kept saving the letters, believing that someday he might find the words that could bridge the chasm he'd created. He remained sober, rebuilt a modest career, and eventually bought the small house where Eleanor now stood, reading the first of hundreds of unsent confessions. Eleanor's fingers cramped as she opened the 20th letter, dated just after you. Her college graduation. Afternoon had faded to evening, the attic growing dim around her. Shaquille had brought her water, then left her alone with the box and its revelations. Eleanor. I sat in the back row today, watching you accept your diploma. You looked so much like your mother, the same determined walk, chin high. 7 years sober now, and this was my reward, seeing the woman you've become, even if only from a distance. Her breath caught. You were there? Shaquille's voice startled her. Every graduation, your wedding, Noah's birth, he watched from afar, never wanted to intrude, but couldn't bear to miss the moments. Eleanor looked up, vision blurred. Why didn't you tell me? Would you have listened? Shaquille settled beside her. You had to want to know. She turned back to the letters, moving through the years, her wedding day. I wanted so badly to walk you down the aisle, but seeing you so radiant, so loved, was enough. Her son's birth. He has your eyes, that same curious intensity. Her divorce 5 years ago. I wish I could tell you that heartbreak heals, that starting over gets easier, but I'd be lying. In between life events were ordinary letters, observations about seasons changing, books he'd read, thoughts about family and forgiveness. Some contained photographs. David at AA milestone celebrations, holding plaques from the community college where he eventually became an admissions counselor, helping other late-in-life students find their way. He kept this one separate, Shaquille said quietly, handing her a sealed envelope with yesterday's date, written just before David slipped into his final coma. Said it was the most important one. Eleanor's hands shook as she opened it, unfolding a single page. My dearest Eleanor, by the time you read this, I'll be gone. The doctors gave me time to say goodbye, though I'm saying it to an empty room. There's symmetry in that, I suppose. Leaving, in silence, just as I arrived in your life again. I've written to you for 23 years without response, and still these letters saved me. Writing to you forced me to become someone worthy of forgiveness, even if that forgiveness never came. I don't ask you to forget what I did. Walking away was my greatest failure, and no amount of sobriety or self-improvement erases that abandonment. But I hope someday you'll understand that I left because I couldn't bear for you to see me at my worst. Pride, my eternal downfall. At my desk downstairs, you'll find a trust for Noah's education. It's everything I saved over the years. Consider it 23 birthdays worth of gifts I never got to give. I love you, Eleanor. I loved you every day I was gone, and I'll love you beyond whatever comes next. Dad. Eleanor clutched the letter to her chest, a sob tearing through. Her decades of carefully cultivated anger crumbled under the weight of words too long unread. He was going to send them all, Shaquille said softly, once he got the diagnosis. But then he lost his nerve. Didn't want you to feel obligated to forgive him just because he was dying. The attic suddenly felt too small, the past too overwhelming. Eleanor stood on shaky legs, the last letter still crushed against her heart. I need some air. Outside, evening had settled over the neighborhood. Eleanor crossed the yard to the ancient oak that overlooked the property. A weathered bench circled its trunk, recently installed, she realized, positioned to catch the sunset. Eleanor sank onto the ice bench, watching as twilight painted the sky in watercolors. Words from her father's letters echoed in her mind, filling in the empty decades with his voice, his regrets, his quiet presence at life's milestones. The sound of small feet on grass pulled her from her thoughts. Noah, her 10-year-old son, approached cautiously. Uncle Shaquille said you might need this. He offered a mug of steaming tea. She accepted it with a grateful smile, studying the face that had always reminded her of someone she couldn't quite place. Now she saw it clearly. Her, father's contemplative gaze, the same slight furrow between his brows. Did you know him? Eleanor asked suddenly. Your grandfather? Noah settled beside her. Sometimes Uncle Shaquille would take me to the park to meet him. He taught me how to play chess. He hesitated. Was that okay? Eleanor's throat tightened. All these years, her father had known her son, loved him from a respectful distance she'd enforced without understanding what she was keeping at bay. Yes, she whispered. That was okay. He gave me something for you before he got really sick. Noah reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, smooth stone. He said it's from the river where he used to take you fishing when you were little. Eleanor accepted. The stone, its surface cool and familiar against her palm. She remembered those fishing trips, her father's patient hands showing her how to tie knots, his delighted laugh when she caught her first trout. She'd forgotten those moments, buried them beneath the memory of his departure. Did you hate him? Noah asked with a child's directness. Uncle Shaquille said you were really mad for a long time. Eleanor considered the question, turning the stone over in her fingers. I wanted to hate him, she admitted. It was easier than missing him. Noah nodded with unexpected understanding. Like when you and Dad got divorced. Sometimes I pretended I was mad so I wouldn't feel sad. Eleanor pulled her son close, amazed at his wisdom and struck by the parallel he'd unwittingly drawn. She'd divorced Noah's father after discovering his affair. Another abandonment, another excuse to build walls. We're quite the pair, aren't we? She murmured into Noah's hair. Holding on to hurt because it feels safer than letting go. Grandpa said that too. Noah pulled back to look at her. He said the Chens are stubborn that way, good at anger, bad at forgiveness. Eleanor laughed despite herself, recognizing the truth in those words. The setting sun cast long shadows across the yard as mother and son sat in companionable silence, sharing the weight of a family legacy more complex than Eleanor had allowed herself to see. Later, Noah sleeping upstairs in what had been Shaquille's childhood room, Eleanor returned to the attic and the box of letters. There were hundreds she hadn't read yet, a lifetime of one-sided conversations waiting to be heard. She gathered them carefully, along with the photographs and mementos tucked between pages. Downstairs, Shaquille sat at the kitchen table where they'd eaten countless family meals in another lifetime. He looked up as she entered, his expression cautious. I'm not selling the house, Eleanor said quietly, setting the box on the table between them. Shaquille raised an eyebrow. You're not? Noah should know where his family comes from. And she touched the box gently. I have a lot of catching up to do. It'll take time, Shaquille warned, reading all those, processing everything. Eleanor nodded, thinking of the stone in her pocket, the fishing trips, the father who'd watched her graduate from a distance rather than disrupt her life. Time is what I never gave him. It's what I owe myself now. She pulled out a chair and sat across from her brother, really seeing him for the first time in years. The weight he'd carried alone, the bridge he'd tried to build between father and daughter. Tell me about him, Shaquille. Tell me about the man he became after he left. Outside, stars emerged in the darkening sky, silent witnesses to the complex geometry of family, the way orbits could be broken and reformed, the gravity that pulled, hearts back together across impossible distances. And in a house filled with ghosts and possibilities, two siblings began the careful work of reconstructing a father neither had fully known, one through absence, one through forgiveness, their voices mingling with the echoes of letters too long, unread. In the morning, Eleanor would call her office and request extended leave. She would enroll Noah in the local school for the remainder of the term. She would visit her father's grave with flowers and all the words she'd never spoken. But tonight, she would simply listen as Shaquille filled in the missing years, each story a puzzle piece in the portrait of the man who had loved her from afar, waiting for a forgiveness that arrived too late, yet somehow perfectly on time. Character. Count 13 495.